This is hiring.
Hiring on all cylinders.
Welcome, listeners and hirers, an audience herein one and the same. The podcast is one member short for this edition of Hiring on All Cylinders. Sadly, Lonnie, as she mentioned last week, is out on the Lonnie Spratt Customer Success World Tour 2015, t-shirts pending. But to make up for it, we have joining us a very special guest, one of my favorite people in the world of recruiting, having spent considerable time at numerous rungs up the recruiting ladder, including his senior role at Warner Brothers and consulting role at Walt Disney. Ever heard of those guys? He is now a lucid and prolific publisher, the managing editor of RecruitingBlogs, and regular contributor to Recruiting Daily. Matt Charney, thanks for being here today.
And thank you for that intro that was not only very awesome, that I didn't have to actually write.
Yeah, yeah. Is that a normal thing? Do you typically have to write your own byline?
Yeah, and it's really awkward too. I always forget that somebody's got to read that while I stand there when I send it in. So I always send the long version, and I just have to sit there.
Right, and you're nodding you're butchering it, man. You're totally ruining it.
It's just I always have that, man, I should have rewritten that and make that sound even cooler type thing.
Oh, yeah.
You just made me sound way more badass than I am. So much appreciated.
Okay, was it at least accurate then?
Yeah. No, I except for the fact that I would say I'm not in the recruiting world, so to speak. I would say that I'm in the world of marketers that talk about recruiting at this point in time.
All right. Well, we have that in common, but what we don't have in common is that you have actually spent, your role was purely recruiting. I've done some recruiting as part of my job, but you were a all-in-all recruiter for a good amount of time.
Yeah, no, I've recruited for a bunch of Fortune 500 organizations, whether through that's RPO role or actually in-house as I was, Amgen, Warner Brothers, and Disney. So glad to have gotten out of that and glad for the experience as well. So
yeah, actually, I was hoping for a little more color commentary on that switch from actually frontline recruiting to your more editorial role now.
Yeah, so it's one of those weird things where I couldn't have predicted that social media and content marketing would actually be applicable to recruiting. So when I was at those roles, I was kind of just too lazy, I think, to pick up the phone, which makes me like most recruiters.
Right.
So this was back in the day, so I started doing what we now refer to as social recruiting and employer branding and inbound marketing. Which really, at the time was just because I thought the internet was easier and more scalable way to find candidates, and it was easier to have them come to me than vice versa. And, it's been interesting to see that codified. So, I just started Disney's first Facebook page because I thought, that may be a place we could potentially find candidates. And now they have 35 people, I think, working full time on that. So it's just been a weird evolution. And I was lucky enough to land at Monster and help start their social media function, which I think was kind of the perfect way to really straddle the fence from, I would say being at a practitioner to now being completely independent editorially and getting to cover the industry. So
cool. So a couple of topics on the docket. I kind of want to, I drew a little bit from what you've been writing on recently. One is we've talked a good deal, even on this podcast, about recruitment messaging. I want to dig a little deeper beyond the take your project or take a project and insert it into an email. But first, I want to talk a little bit about recruiting conferences, just because, number one, I just came from one. I spent the last 2 days at the Greenhouse Customer Summit, which was great. Greenhouse are an awesome company, full of really cool people. Their product is very neat, integrates with everyone, and has really sort of slid into the early stages of the hiring cycle very seamlessly and are helping a ton of people out. And just being that it's conference season, Matt, I've watched you via Twitter sort of all over the world. You were in Australia, I think, at one conference.
I was in Australia twice last year.
Oh yeah, both for conferences?
Yeah, so one was the Australasian Talent Conference and the other was the Social Sourcing Summit. So okay. Either way, it's always nice to get a paid trip to go down under.
Right. Yeah. Not a bad trip.
So occupational hazard.
So then when you're dealing with recruiting conferences, I basically want to know how do you get the most out of them? What are the best ones? Is networking just like swapping business cards and then not doing anything after? Where's the real value in going to these conferences?
So I think that, that really depends on what your objective is for being there in the first place. So, I can't speak as a practitioner necessarily, because I'm acutely aware when I go to a lot of these that, I'm at one every week, whereas, most of the attendees are there one every, maybe they'll get out once a year.
Right.
But so speaking as me, in terms of the value that I particularly am looking at for conferences, and one that I've always gotten, whether I was, a practitioner or a presenter, or as is now the case, somebody just kind of sits and snarkily tweets what's going on. I think for me, the real value of a conference is being able to see a bunch of different perspectives, which are never the same, kind of converge and really have, interactions around the same topics, but from completely different perspectives, whether that's a vendor, whether that's a practitioner, whether that's like, a speaker or consultant, thought leader, whatever you want to call it. So I think that the conversation that happens is more valuable than the actual content. But as far as networking goes at these things, I really think that that's where the obvious value comes in. I think that what happens in the hallways is way more important than what happens in the main stage.
Definitely, yeah.
And, I think that one thing that I always do when I go to a conference is I look at who's going to be there ahead of time. Either, I'll get a heads up on the attendee list, or I'll look at the other speakers on there, and I'll really just choose one or two people who I want to specifically get to know, who I don't yet know. And it's just, an easy and incremental way to grow my network. So I would definitely encourage people to do their due diligence before a conference and figure out who's going there, and in addition to what the content of the actual agenda is. Because, you're only getting half of the value if you focus specifically on the takeaways instead of the actual networking and those opportunities.
Right, because if you're not meeting people, like, you might as well just be reading Matt Charney's snarky tweets about it, right? Like, you can get a lot of the content from not being there. You obviously don't get the full effect, but even just watching these hashtags, man, people are nonstop talking about what's going on there. So you would recommend almost make like a hit list of like, all right, I got to make sure I network with this person.
Yeah, absolutely. But don't be the guy who goes around looking at people's like name badges. That's the most obnoxious thing. You're like, oh, is this person have the title in a company that's worth talking to? Like, definitely just talk to everyone, because I've met, CEOs of some really big companies, CHROs of, Fortune 5 companies, just like hanging around out in the hallway over coffee. I didn't know who the hell they were. So I think that that's a really important thing too, and a trap that a lot of people fall into. But in terms of following the hashtag, I think that for me, I'm acutely aware that when I stop tweeting at a conference is when it gets good.
Yeah.
So there seems to be, a direct proportion to social media noise and actual content value.
I love what you said about not being the guy like sniping name placards, because you get that. You get people walking around and like some people, they're there in their mind, I'm here to meet this certain kind of person. And then you get like the 2 sentences into the conversation with them. Oh, I'm so-and-so from this. And they're like, oh, what's your role? And then like you see like the interest fade from their face. And it's like, hey man, if you didn't want to have these conversations, why are you surrounded by 200 people, all of whom you knew were going to be coming to this thing?
Yeah, like networking in a room full of recruiters is a huge surprise. That's going to go down.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, wow. No, but, I also think that those are the people who actually go out to network inevitably fail at it, which is why, like, that's just the most obnoxious thing in the world. There's nothing more transparent than somebody who wants something. So just if you don't have an agenda, you're going to nail whatever it is you ultimately want to get out of it.
Yep, exactly, Matt. It's like, this is why I think it's so important to actually do the homework beforehand, is because if you want to meet someone very specific, then just like ping them and tell them, hey, like, you know what, let's just grab like 15 minutes at that Starbucks and chat. And, that's probably the easiest way to just make sure that if there's someone specific that you want to get in touch with, just do it that way. But outside of that, just like treat everyone the same. I mean, just, just like be like respectful. And, I've learned some like tactics for, when I'm in a conversation I know that's not going to be helpful. There are ways that, that you can get out while still being respectful. And I figured that those are, generally speaking, the easier ways that for me to be like efficient, without being, without being an asshole.
Yeah, if you have a problem getting out of a non-viable conversation and you're a recruiter, like you have way bigger things to worry about.
Yeah, that's gonna follow you.
Like stay in the office and work on the fundamentals. But yeah, and I would say, another thing that always fascinates me at conferences is people go to these sessions and literally, every speaker puts their contact information, out there.
Yeah.
I always do and say, if you have any follow-up questions, reach out to me. And nobody ever takes advantage of that. I've talked to, other people who speak at as many conferences as I do. And I just, have no idea why that is, that you'd go to listen to somebody talk. They, give you an open opportunity to contact them, follow up, keep the conversation going, and then nothing. I think, though, that is an indictment on both candidate experience and probably the quality of my and the other people I know's content. So
yeah, and exactly. Maybe people are intimidated, like, oh, this keynote speaker isn't going to want to hang around with me, but like they're there for a reason, like I said earlier. And I just came from this conference, and I chatted with Lou Adler, I chatted with Stacy Zappar. These are people with massive networks who are rubbing shoulders with the
Did you do fireball shots with Stacy?
So she, before she went on, she made a quick dip out to the liquor store. She's like, this is a tradition, I have to do it. So I was like, oh wow, you are way cooler in person than you are online, which I didn't think was possible. Yeah,
I like that she has now turned it into a quote tradition. I think that now I'm going to have a good thing to call all of the bad habits I do to get ready to go on stage.
I can't stop. It's a tradition. Yeah, that's a good way.
Yeah, no, I probably need to switch to Fireball though. She's a great speaker and far better than I. So
maybe that's the secret.
Yeah, but that's awesome. But she's a perfect example of somebody who will totally like respond immediately. Her and like Lars, I don't know how they do it, but they totally will. And I just I don't want to get people's inboxes filled or anything, but just take advantage of that stuff, man.
Yeah, exactly. So similarly to picking good conferences and making the most out of them, there is so much content. Matt, you and I are both creators of it, and every vendor is trying to be the New York Times of their own field. For recruiters specifically, where should they look for the best education and training when there's so much noise out there?
I like that you use that example. I don't know if it's intentional, but I always use the New York Times as my benchmark too, in that I am trying to be the New York Post, which actually is read by more people who actually are buying in market, as it were, than the Times. But that said, I think that you're absolutely right. Like I'm right before this conversation. I was sitting there trying to put together yet another post about why people should use mobile for recruiting, and it's like, oh my god, really? Am I still writing this?
Is anyone on the other side of that debate? Is anyone like, nah, mobile's gonna blow over and no one's gonna need to recruit on it? Like by now, you should know to do that, right?
Yeah, it's like you're gonna get the same response to that as by saying diversity is something that's good.
Exactly.
Okay, I get it. Let's move on.
It's not risky.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I think for me, what you should really focus in on is content that has nothing to do with recruiting. Because I think what you get in this space largely is a lot of what's going on right now. If you want to be forward looking, then I would say pay attention to what's going on in the business units you support. So, for instance, I used to recruit for corporate finance and strategy, something I know absolutely nothing about as somebody with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in screenwriting. But in order to prep for that, I read such exciting publications as the AICPA newsletter and, the SEC Journal and other really, really boring stuff that also let me know more insight into what my candidates do than, let's say, a blog about why big data matters. Right. So I would say that's one thing to focus on. And also, just consumer tech stuff, everywhere from your Mashables and Tech Crunches, even to, socialmedia.org and some of the other resources out there are kind of, where HR and recruiting technology is going to be in, let's say, 5 years. So if you want to know where the industry is going, don't pay attention to what's going on in it now. Okay, so is that the advantage then in following the industry rather than like the basics of your craft, which is what a lot of the content out there is? Yeah, well, here's the thing. If you want to be the key to being a successful recruiter is being able to form an affinity and relationship with the candidate. If you don't know what it is they do, then you can't legitimately sell why they should take a job,
Right.
because you don't know what that job is. So I would argue that you're better spent using your time figuring out that part of the equation than how to actually sell an opportunity you know nothing about.
Right. So rather than here's how to message candidates, it's here's how to learn exactly what they're working on, so that you could read all those posts you want about how to message, but like the actual material you're going to write down, if you don't know anything about JSpec, you're not going to be able to engage with them at all.
I actually spend a lot of time reading basically Hacker News, and Hacker News has served as a very good avenue for me to at least be in tune with what engineers care about, and actually not just about what they care about, but like what like the kind of like more forward-thinking engineers think about. So when I do chat with like other candidates, I can talk about a stack, I can talk about newer technologies in a way where they're impressed. This is all relative too. Like if I'm just better than like everyone else is at this, then that gives me a like very huge leg up with those candidates.
Right. And I also think, to your point, there's nothing that's more obnoxious or a waste of time than sending candidates opportunities that they're not at all suited for. But if you intrinsically kind of know what the substance behind a keyword is, then that's a mistake that's not going to happen. And obviously, even if it's an in-mail, which is a very low response rate, you're more likely to respond to it if it's very clear up front that person knows their stuff and that they know why they want you for an opportunity.
Yeah, positioning yourself less as a recruiter and more as just someone who knows where they're coming from.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think that there's a weariness that you're going to talk to somebody who's going to be a total dumbass, on the other end, and who's going to ask you like your greatest weakness and try to find out what your salary is, right?
Right.
So,
yeah.
So if it's somebody who you can just like talk shop with, that's going to be a much more attractive callback, I think.
Yeah, and like the thing too is like, when I first started tech recruiting, like I'm not good enough to really ask questions that are more pointed, that are like algorithmic questions, etc. I mean, I could do that probably like soon enough. I actually don't talk about comp usually on a first call. I try really hard to actually avoid it until later. But what I do try to make sure is at least understand our own stack. If I can understand what we use and I can talk intelligently about that, that goes a long ways towards candidates being like, okay, hey, this guy actually understands what they're doing, and they can start to craft, okay, is this a good fit for me? And I feel like that's like at least the first step. And then after that, if you get really good, then you should definitely start like asking far more pointed questions that are far more specific to, their knowledge base.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree that unless you're the hiring manager, you definitely need to remove yourself as much as possible as being an intermediary. So absolutely agree with that statement. And yeah, the fact that you don't talk about comp probably means you end up making good hires.
Hopefully.
So far, so good.
That is what I would like to think. We'll see how that pans out long term, but I'm pretty bullish about that.
Nice.
So this actually answers another question that I wanted to discuss, which has to do with the whole like what's the best content, how do you separate the signal from the noise. Matt, in one of your recent blog posts, you were writing about how safe most content is, how most of it isn't really shedding a light on anything. You wrote, in his great Poetics, Aristotle held that there are only 7 different stories out there, for example, man versus man, and any deviation is simply an embellishment built on a universal foundation, which means that even a few hundred centuries ago, all the good ideas were taken. So
this is true.
So then, this is true. I agree with that. I agree with what I wrote.
Yeah, well, I just like that you're quoting Aristotle. That's
yeah. Well, yeah, does that not lend credence to the argument that I was making through Aristotle?
It does. Really, now we have just walked into a Richard Linklater movie.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying this.
Exactly. So, to that point, even if you don't say, hey, based on your experience, I think you'd be a great fit for this hot new opportunity, even if you say you do the minimum, which is what most recruiters do, which is find one line and say, I loved your work on this project and how you worked on the team at this company, so that they know that it was at least tailored to them. That's not really enough, is it? Is that still to say that that's just a deviation of a universal foundation?
So I think that when you're talking about creating that first touch point, you actually want to go for universal. Because everyone obviously is motivated by the same thing. This is borne out in scientific studies as well as the philosophy of which we were speaking, and that is people want to be individually recognized and appreciated. So yeah, I think you absolutely are speaking to universal, driver by personalizing. That said, if you use the word opportunity ever, like, that's a red flag.
Yep.
Opportunity for whom? For you to fill a job.
Exactly.
So if the job's worth taking, then you know that you have some basically a hot commodity. Why do you have to sell it? Instead, I think that by really focusing on wanting to get to know them as a person, and messaging around that's the most effective thing. If you know everything else, and you know that there's a reason that you're reaching out to them in the first place, then you should really be focusing on the bigger picture than just, do you qualify for the specific job? You should have already answered that question.
Right. So almost like, why is there even a job here to be filled? It's because there is this success, there is this need, and then that it necessitates the skill set that goes along with it.
Yeah, it's like, Rod Blagojevich, like when he had to fill that Senate seat. If your job's worth taking to, a true A player, it's going to be like, this thing is golden,
Right, exactly. I love you said I don't have to sell it. But at the same time, if you're trying to fill some kind of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a really unsexy role in Wichita, Kansas. Like,
supervisor? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Like, how are you, like, that might not be a cliche hot new opportunity, and you do have to do a little selling, but then the answer is recruit at a cooler company. I don't know.
I mean, while I'm not aware how supervisor intentionally chose an occupation that I felt unlikely to listen to this podcast, apologies if I was wrong on that. I think those are ones that are more or less high volume, high turnover. And that's really less recruiting than it is process and branding, right?
Sure.
So those I think are a little bit different than if you're going after somebody with Hadoop experience who's built analytic solutions.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense. I feel like we are dancing around a pretty common theme here, so I want to talk about, in a high level fashion, what are recruiters doing wrong? And I don't mean to say recruiting is broken, because I think that's lazy and tired to suggest that, but rather, how do recruiters get better? How does the industry garner a little more respect? Is it more tools? Is it more data? What's going to make recruiters advance?
I think that recruiting is broken, despite that being the first slide on every single vendor's PowerPoint in the history of the world.
Yep.
Somehow we have a really low unemployment rate, and people still get hired and jobs still get filled, which leads me to believe that, in fact, it's not.
Well, of course, like it's
not broken.
Believing that there's nothing wrong leaves you no reason to buy anything from these vendors, though, right?
Well, that's obviously correct, and there are obvious ways to improve efficiency and efficacy.
Yeah.
But we should look at that as being iterative rather than prescriptive, I would say.
Of course.
We don't want to go back and reinvent the wheel, and that, I think, is the biggest problem with recruiting today. I'm not going to say what recruiters are doing wrong, because frankly, I think that I'm not in the position to make that accusation as a sweeping generality. But that said, what I think, I just see is there's so much unnecessary added complexity. So the fact that you have a job, you're trying to fill it. When you've closed a requisition, you've done recruiting. Wow. I mean, like, it's the same process we've always done. And yeah, maybe the tools are evolving a little bit, maybe the tech's evolving a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's still the exact same thing as it's always been. And this focus on things like, I'm going to build a talent community, or, I'm going to build a lead nurturing campaign to turn passive candidates into active applicants. Like, cool, if that works. But ultimately, you still got to make an offer that's accepted, and you still got to onboard them. That hasn't changed.
No.
And I think if you just strip it back and really look at the fundamentals of what works to facilitate that, and getting better on the fundamentals, then you're better served by focusing on the next new shiny thing.
There's one thing which I would add, which is, if there is one thing specifically that I think is actually kind of like a fundamental part of this process that I feel like a lot of recruiters don't spend enough time on. It's get to understand what that rec is. I can't tell you how many times that I actually meet people that don't do enough homework there, where they don't actually speak with their hiring manager, where they don't understand, okay, what is the right type of person here? And if you don't do that homework, that's what results in I'd say all that bad behavior that we see. And this is something which I spend, or at least I try to spend a lot of time doing up front, which is talk to, like, let's say our VP of engineering or our VP of sales, understand what is the role that they're looking for, who is the right type of fit, and then before I start reaching out, when I have that good understanding, it gets so much easier, and I can actually do my job a hell of a lot faster too that way. If there's an area that I think which is just a fundamental part that needs to be improved, that's probably it, and you don't need tools for that.
No, you don't. And further to that point, you should never, as a recruiter, open a requisition without first meeting a hiring manager. And if you don't have time to do that, then, I would say that you probably don't have a whole lot of respect for the candidate's time either.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So the great minds think alike, apparently.
Yeah. What's I don't know, I'm trying to think if there's something I can say to make you guys disagree and then fight each other.
So who do you have winning this NCAA bracket, Matt?
Yeah, that's not even controversial this year, right? It's obviously Kentucky has 10 future NBA players on their roster. I don't think they're going down, but my Jayhawks are already out, so I don't really care.
That's the Kentucky coach. He's a great recruiter.
He is a great recruiter, and also proof that, a little extra comp here and there never hurt anyone.
It's like created a self-fulfilling system there, because you do it really well at first, and then it's easier to attract the next ones, right? If you, as a recruiter, get a bunch of really good talent in your organization, they're going to kick ass, and your product is going to move, and your company is going to look really cool. The better talent you add on at the beginning, it's going to make it easier and easier as you go.
And you're not on the hook for compliance violations.
Exactly.
Once you find your next gig. So I think that's the other lesson there.
There's actually one other thing which I would mention that I think Calipari does really well that actually applies when it comes towards general recruiting, which is one of the reasons why he gets all these great people is because he doesn't front with them. He's like, hey, if you just want to come here, play for 1 year, and then just like go off to the NBA, then go do it. And I think he's like way more honest about that than I think a lot of other coaches are. And that actually like leads me to start thinking, what are some things that recruiters and hiring managers can do within companies, which is be real with them about, hey, how can we help them grow? How can I help you succeed in this role? And if you think about it from like their perspective a little bit more, your job becomes a hell of a lot easier, and then they start coming to you as opposed to you having to go and find them yourself.
Exactly. Like with these Kentucky basketball players, they're thinking, all right, these guys, their goal is to go to, like any college basketball player, they want to go to the NBA and make millions of dollars. It's exactly like our CEO Bishke says, tell me about your next job. So it's like, how do I help you get from here to there? And then he's always, that is Kentucky's coach, is always, he's defending his guys. Like, they're like, oh, they only stay for 1 year. And he's like, well, that's what they want. Like, who am I to say that you should stay for 4 years?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think I agree with that. And, I think that one thing that Kentucky is a good example of is the fact that if you get the best talent that's available and don't worry about finding necessarily a fit for them, like, oh shit, we already have an all-American point guard, right? We have no need for another one. Like, just get the best people out there on the market and then figure out what to do with them.
That question actually came up at the conference earlier, was like, if you get someone who's really talented, but then you look at your roles and you're like, I don't know if you're a good fit. Like, maybe you didn't source them actively, maybe it was a referral, and you're like, wow, you're obviously incredibly talented. I'm not really sure what the role for you here is, though. Do you just grab them and say, all right, we'll figure out what you do later? Do you create a role? How do you deal with a really talented candidate that maybe isn't a perfect fit for any of your roles?
I think ideally that's how you hire as an organization, right? I would say that you don't. You get into a bad place when you're reactively, backfilling a requisition. I think you're in a really good place when you scout, right? And you kind of constantly have your eye on people who might be a good fit. But that's where culture happens, right? Like, once you get that understanding, this is somebody who not only knows their stuff, but could go a variety of different directions. If there's an open head count, you better rethink that head count. Now, obviously, a lot of people don't have that flexibility, But you should always have a definitive answer to the question, if I run into somebody who's an A player who I just can't do anything with for an open role, what do I do with them then? And if the answer is nothing, then you're more or less failing to beat the competition because they're going to go right there.
You don't shape people to roles, right? You shape roles of people. Like there are people don't exist in the shape of the job description you write.
If you only hire somebody for an open job, you're hiring for a specific skill set to a specific need, then what you're doing is you're consigning somebody to that same role. You're basically saying that you're okay with that person being in a rut or using them until, the next best thing comes along. Because if that's really the only thing that they can do in an organization, they're not going to be able to move on or be of any utility to you. That's why I think that ultimately the premium really has to be placed not on what somebody's done, but what they can do, and hire around that. That's really, a strategy to make sure that you're firing on all cylinders. And you're Kentucky, not Kansas, which, tries to start seniors no matter what and loses.
Great analogy. Matt, this has been awesome. I think we're getting close to the ideal time for a podcast, which, as I say, is the length of an average commute. This has been a lot of fun. I knew that you would knock it out of the park. So thanks a ton for joining us.
No, thank you for having me, and appreciate the conversation.
Awesome. All right, I guess this is where I do the conclusion that I haven't written yet. I still need a pithy happy hunting, or I don't know. Matt, do you have any ideas? Did you hang out? No, he's still there.
I think happy hunting is awesome, actually.
Really?
But you have to say it really really sardonically.
Get really close to the mic. Okay. I can't tell if you're messing with me right now.
No, I like things that are as ironically cheesy as possible. I'm not even kidding.
Okay,
you just really play it up. Actually come up with the cheesiest boilerplate you can. Go against every marketing precept in your body, and you will have something that's close to the right answer for an outro.
Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Charney, thank you so much for joining us this week. We were able to cover conferences, taking the next step with messaging, and educating yourself as a recruiter. From Rob Stevenson and everyone here at Intello and Hiring on All Cylinders, thanks for joining us, and happy hunting.